Plenary 5, topic Ethics, Fundamental Rights and Big Data. Plenary speakers Christopher Graham, Information Commissioner, United Kingdom; Scott Taylor, HPVP and co-chair of the Foundation of Big Data Best Practices Project; Cedric Burton, of counsel and lawyer Wilson Sonsini; Brendan Lynch, Chief Privacy Officer, Microsoft; Mila Romanov, Legal Specialist, United Nations Global Pulse, with moderator Martin Abrams, Information Accountability Foundation.
Hello, everybody. I'm Marty Abrams, and it's a pleasure to be here. As many of you know, I have a long history in being interested in big data. We have an incredibly distinguished panel. I've given them instructions, and that is that the initial intervention is 8 minutes, no more than 8 minutes. That behind my chair I have a cutlass. I'm not afraid to use that cutlass, so everybody is going to speak very succinctly, and when we reach 8 minutes, we're going to move on to the next individual. Yesterday, when we had some of our initial panels and the report from the closed session, big data was a big part of that discussion. And one of the points that came out of that discussion is we need to move beyond fair information practice principles, which are indeed very important, but we really need to move on to the whole question of ethics. And how does one enforce a system of ethics in the world of big data? As you think about big data and you think about the 4.4 million technologists that are going to be added to IT organizations to bring big data more completely into place, we need to think about how we're going to oversee that process, how many people are going to be involved in it, what is the framework they're going to use to really make big data inbounds. And that's what this panel is really about. It's about making sure that big data is ethically framed. And to make sure that we really align with the rest of the conference, Jakob Konstam yesterday said we should have a fierce debate on this question. And our challenge, the challenge of this panel, is to begin that fierce debate. And with that, I'd like to pass the mic over to my friend Scott Taylor. Thank you, Marty.
I also appreciate being here and the ability to share some information about our thoughts related to the need for ethics in big data. We've heard the last couple of days these concepts that there are unprecedented opportunities that come with big data, but I would also agree that there are unprecedented risks that come with big data if it is not properly overseen, governed, and there are some other considerations put into the mix. And I believe that the basis for our challenges with big data is the inclusion of ethics. It's something that, as we've been talking about big data for the last few years, rarely does the concept until now of ethics come into the equation. So I think it's a very important point and something very valuable for us to consider. Not sure how, there we go, okay. As you look at the paper that we've begun working on in the foundation, we first started by looking at different ethical frameworks that exist in the world today, and there are a variety of them. And our attempt has been to look at those and harmonize them in the context of information management. What we started to realize is that there is a set of values that start to emerge as you think about the integration of ethics into these decisions. And this is just the high level of what these values are. It includes that there needs to be a value that the result is beneficial, that there's a sense of purpose, that we can define the benefits, that we understand who is actually receiving those benefits, and that there's a balance between the benefits and the risks that we've been talking about. Another value that we've identified is that there should be a concept that it is progressive. It needs to be materially better. If we're going to employ big data and the risks that come with it, it needs to be materially better than safer ways of achieving the same result. It needs to be measurable. This is important. It also needs to support innovation, but at the same time, as I mentioned, it needs to consider the risks that come with this new form of data analysis. We also believe that it needs to be sustainable. Now, this term is not necessarily easily understood, but in the paper, I think it gives you a little bit more background of what we're trying to convey. It needs to be sustainable in terms of the legal basis to process and permissions to do that processing. We also need to think about the influence that the models or modeling may create. Those influences could be good, but they could also be very negative. We also need to think about the longevity. Milk expires, and so does data. Data has a half-life, and there are negative consequences if we don't consider the longevity of the insights that are gained. We also need to ensure that there is an ability to refine and correct misinformation, bad inferences, bad data, data that goes bad over time. Also very important, and I think these are the two of the most important values, is that it needs to be respectful. We need to respect the data origination and also the restrictions that come with that data. The context and the purpose needs to be understood in an honest fashion. We need to think about the interests of all parties, and there is an important component related to societal expectations, individual expectations, and as we've talked the last couple of days, legitimate and fundamental rights. It also needs to be fair. And I know this seems so simple, that it needs to be fair, but it's not that simple. It needs to consider the insights and how those insights will be applied, the inferences and the potential discrimination that can come from that, the labeling of individuals, and as Jakob said yesterday, the concept of predestination. It's probably one of the biggest harms that could come from bad big data. It also needs to consider compatibility and a legal basis to process, which starts to loop back to some of the earlier values. Not sure this is working. If somebody can help me, there we go. So as we've started to think about the assessment or the interrogation that one would go through related to ethics, we've talked a lot about use, both positive and negative. We've talked a lot about risk assessment, and you see use and application and risk assessment in this sequence. But I would argue that there are some important components that have been missing. Above use, you see a recognition of the category or the type of data that you would begin with, both the originating pair or the inference that comes from it. We need to consider how that information is going to be used or applied. But I would argue that as we get through an interrogation or an assessment from an ethical basis, we really need to add in the component of what is the motivation or objective of the party applying or using the data. Quite frankly, I think a lot of insights are going to come if we interrogate the motivation behind the use. Then I think we have a basis to begin an iterative risk assessment process. Ultimately, that risk assessment needs to be filtered through a final set of considerations which bring in ethics and values. Values of not only the organization, but the societies in which the data is going to be applied. There's also a set of considerations that can be taken into account. These include things like context, respect for the law and norms in particular jurisdictions, harms and legitimate and fundamental rights, fairness, anti-discrimination. There are many considerations that can be taken into account. I also think it needs to be additionally considered what mitigations may be put in place to help improve the ultimate application or use of information. And finally, I'm actually a biochemist, and I know that Alan Chang is a chemist, Paula Breening is a chemist, and maybe I have come at privacy from this type of science background. But I think of an analogy, a metaphor of big data, and I think back to chemistry. And if you think about the history of chemistry, there's a lot of parallels. These are the recognized definitions of chemistry, chemical change, and chemical reaction. Chemistry is all about putting together two different elements, molecules, molecular structures, and they become something else. This is an inference in our world. You can see in the middle of the diagram, you can put two molecular structures together. It can result in both good or bad things depending on how that is done. Heat may result in a good structure. Without that heat in the process, it could be something very bad. Chemistry results in things that are either dangerous or beneficial or useful. I think that there's a lot of analogies as we think about big data. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think we need to look at history, other areas, and apply those concepts to big data. The final slide is, I thought it was interesting to just replace the word chemistry with big data. And if you look at how that definition works, we need to think about how data changes, and more importantly, the data reaction. Just as in chemistry, when you combine two things and you get a third thing, it is either dangerous or beneficial. Interesting in chemistry, we have figured out we don't just dump two things together. We are able to model statistically what we think the reaction will be to mitigate risk. I think that there's a lot of analogies between chemistry and big data. So thank you.
My thanks to Scott. The paper that Scott is talking about is a unified ethical frame for big data analysis. I have a few copies, and it's available from the Foundation website for those who haven't gotten a copy yet. I hope it's going to be a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. So let's turn to Chris. Chris, the ICO felt it very necessary to produce guidance on big data, even though you said big data is just beginning to emerge in the United Kingdom. So would you tell us why you felt so necessary to create that guidance?
Well, I think big claims are made for big data. I was interested in the chemistry analogy just now. Sometimes when you hear people talking about big data, it sounds like alchemy, and it is producing gold. It's the elixir that we must all seek. And clearly it was important for the ICO to engage with this development and make sure that we didn't get so carried away with all the excitement about a new technique that we somehow felt that it had changed everything and changed the world and the old rules no longer apply. I want to pay tribute to the work that the Foundation has done here, because I think the ethical framework that you've described is absolutely what's required. Of course, the next thing is going to be the accountability piece, because it's one thing to say, here are our ethical principles. The other thing is to apply them, and a third thing is for the regulator to be sufficiently across the complexities of big data to be able to intervene appropriately if those ethical claims aren't being lived up to. And I think the role of the regulator is a very positive one here, because basically it helps people who aspire to an ethical approach to stick to ethical principles if they know that the guys who frankly couldn't give a monkeys are going to be dealt with effectively. So accountability has got to be much more than, this is all very complicated and you really wouldn't understand it, but trust me, I know what I'm doing. Trust me, you won't feel a thing. In the UK context, I would say, trust me, I'm a doctor. Because the big project at the moment in our National Health Service has been something called care.data. And I can see the argument for why big data analytics can offer insights into the performance of the National Health Service, the differential performance of different hospitals, different consultants, different GP practices, different drug treatments. But the man in Whitehall who knows best, who was insisting on rolling out uploading of patient data from doctors' surgeries for all this analysis, simply didn't carry patients with him. And as a result, the whole thing had to be stopped and restarted. It was simply derailed by a lack of trust by patients. So I think the ethical framework is what can begin to win trust in what are really important developments in the commercial world, certainly, but also in the efficient and effective delivery of public service. And that's public services, and that's why the ICO produced the big data paper on which we are consulting. And you can find it on our ICO website, www.ico.org.uk, and you've got another couple of days for responding to that consultation, which finishes on the 17th.